Well, Nuremberg succeeded in ways that when we started to deliver on the Nuremberg legacy, didn't quite work. And of course, one must remember the Tokyo trials at the same time were a lot less successful, largely because the Americans decided to utterly exempt Hirohito from any kind of suggestion that he might have been culpable. So the evidence was massaged when Tojo let slip at one point that the emperor had approved every policy. It was shock, horror. He was sent down immediately. The next day he came back and said he'd remembered that the emperor had nothing to do with it. And so thanks to that whitewashing of the emperor, the Tokyo trials were far less successful, and Hirohito again lived on happily ever after, indeed posing as a humble marine biologist. He traveled the world. He met the Queen in England in '73. He went over to America to meet Henry Kissinger. He even went to Disneyland and met Mickey Mouse. But he was never held responsible for what more recent publications show was his utter imprimatur on the Japanese aggression, and indeed his central role in refusing any kind of surrender or peace negotiations until the bomb dropped. So then, of course, we do get, as a result of Nuremberg, the great post-war human rights triptych, the Universal Declaration, the Genocide Convention, which promises that intervention in the by states if genocide is committed, and the Geneva Conventions, all in 1948. But then they go in, none of them have enforcement mechanisms attached. And of course, they go into the deep freeze of the Cold War. And we get some splendid conventions over the next 40 or 50 years. We get the Convention Against Torture, the Convention Against Apartheid, the Convention Against Racism, Convention Against Maltreatment of Women and Children. But none of them have any enforcement mechanisms attached, these good conventions. As someone said, surveying the killing fields of Rwanda, the road to hell is paved with good conventions. But you get, I suppose, by 1992, the legacy of Nuremberg is so forgotten that I remember the joke I heard at Sarajevo. What do you do to a man who kills another man? Well, you send him to prison for life. What do you do to a man who kills 20 people? You put them in a mental asylum until they're cured. What do you do to a man who kills 200,000 people? Well, you send them to a luxury hotel in Geneva for peace negotiations. It was a black joke about Milosevic, and it got even blacker. So it wasn't until the very end of the 20th century, a century in which 160 million people have been killed in war or genocide, that you get a number of events that bring back the idea of, or the principle of putting heads of state on trial and answer the question, by what power do you do that? The first was the Pinochet case. General Pinochet came to London to have tea with Mrs. Thatcher. In fact, it was whiskey, but he was arrested on a warrant by a Spanish judge for torture. And he was kept under house arrest for 18 months. It was quite an extraordinary moment. I acted for Human Rights Watch in the Pinochet case 30 years after I'd joined Amnesty International, and my first task with Amnesty International in 1975 was to write letters to General Pinochet, pleading letters, as one did for prisoners of conscience who were being tortured and killed, and letters that were absolutely pointless. But 30 years later, we had got to the stage under the Torture Convention of arresting General Pinochet. And everyone said, oh, you will damage the fragile democracy of Chile. well, so much damage was caused that, of course, when Pinochet went back finally, they were able to do him for massive tax avoidance as well as for the caravan of death. And Michelle Bachelet, who was one of his victims, in the sense that she was imprisoned, her father was killed, he was an honorable Air Force general, became president of Chile. But it was remarkable, the number of, the pressure that was put on Jack Straw and the British government to release Pinochet. We got a lot of pressure from the Pope and the Pope in waiting, from George Bush Sr. and Henry Kissinger, and most remarkably of all, I think, from Fidel Castro, who said this was a terrible insult to Latin American leaders that one of them should be held for trial. But Pinochet was eventually released because of illness, but Milosevic then was brought up by the International Court, the ad hoc court, the ICTY, and followed by Charles Taylor, brought up by the court that I presided over in Sierra Leone, and then, of course, now Karadzic follows Milosevic. I can't say that all these trials have been successful. Milosevic had not his day in court. He was down for a decade in court. The prosecution was going to take 4 years, and they threw the book at him. I think that, but what was established, and what has now been established in a decision, Belgium against the DRC, by the International Court of Justice, is that the world has jurisdiction through Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. The Security Council has the power to establish a court that can decide by way of international criminal law that was created at Nuremberg, can have the jurisdiction or power to put political and military leaders on trial. So in a sense, it's taken us 360 years to get to an answer to Charles I's question to John Cooke and the court, by what power do you try me? We now do have power to try heads of state. It's still a controversial power. See the indictment of Bashir, where countries are running scared. They've set up the International Criminal Court. 108 countries have ratified it precisely to stop the kind of mass murder that the Janjaweed inflicted upon the people of Darfur, according to the prosecutor, at the paid behest of General Bashir and his government. Now that the indictment has been issued, a number of countries, particularly African countries, sadly, have gone to water and don't want the indictment delivered on. So we're still at a controversial stage. Other heads of state, Charles Taylor, Karadzic, and so on, are on trial. Even Pol Pot's lieutenants, very belatedly, have been brought to justice. But the difficulties involved are still considerable, and it's interesting to see the way that John Cooke solved them way back in 1649. Well, that is a summary, perhaps, of the relevance today of what happened in England in the 1640s, that beginnings, the stirrings, once the absolute ruler was overthrown, the liberties, free speech, reasonable liberty of religion and sovereignty, moderate democracy, independence of the judiciary, end of torture, and so forth, came out. And the great question of how you hold your leaders to account, a question that wasn't solved satisfactorily in 1649 and perhaps in 2009, is still subject to some of the same problems.